Is Japan alone the next step for the East Sea, plus the Samsung life? I'm Steve Miller. These stories and more are on the March 16th edition of Asian News Weekly. Greetings and salutations, my excellent friends. I hope you're having a fantastic Sunday morning. It's once more time for Asia News Weekly, and before we jump into the show, I just have to say thank you. Thank you so much for all of your support last week. As I transitioned out of the Chi Ranger podcast into ANW, I wasn't sure how well it would be received. And I have been absolutely blown away by your comments, by your support. It's been amazing. And I was looking at some of the stats, and the stats over on YouTube are pretty good. But over on chiranger.com, where the audio file is hosted, I was just staggered my mind because I was looking at the download figures and nearly 2 gigabytes of audio files have been streamed in just the initial episode. And that is awesome. So I really do appreciate you taking the time to download, taking the time to share and post it either on Facebook or on Google+, Twitter, wherever you do share the podcast. I really do thank you for it. And if you do have friends that are interested in what's going on in Asia, maybe they're coming over here to work or to teach, I hope that you'll continue to share the podcast with them if you think it's something that they would find helpful. But more than that, one of the reasons why I do the podcast, why I do these topical videos over on YouTube, and really the fundamental reason why I am sticking with this format so much is because of the comments and the discussion. I want to share the stories, share my opinion on them, and have that be the launching board for more discussions. One of the things that I really loved while I was in university, during my undergraduate years, was talking about current events, talking about the news, and it's something that I desperately miss. So that's one of the reasons why I have this podcast, and I really relish the comments coming in. So I wanted to share with you part of one of the comments that came in off of Google Plus in response to last week's podcast. And it starts off like this. Steve Miller, regarding what you said about An Jung-gun, the An Jung-gun Memorial, I'm not sure if you don't understand exactly who An Jung-gun was and who he killed, but for Japan to say that An Jung-gun is a terrorist and criminal for killing Ito Hirobumi is the same as the British government saying that George Washington and the rest of the founding fathers of the United States are all terrorists and criminals for killing important British generals. And I think that is a great comment. And if you take a look at the relationship between the UK and the United States back in 1776, I think the UK, the British monarchy, would classify the Americans as terrorists. So I think it's a direct correlation. I think it's perfect, absolutely perfect. And it also highlighted some of the challenges here in East Asia about putting into perspective and taking into consideration the context of certain stories. I love hearing all of these points of views. It also showed that how, from a Japanese perspective, exactly why criticizing a visit to the Yasukuni Shrine would be equal to the Han Shrine. It's a great point of discussion, and as the week progresses, it's great to see more of those pop up, either in the comment section on chiranger.com, through Twitter, through Google+, or on YouTube. So this is great, and I can't wait to see what comes about this week. Leading off the news this week is, of course, some information about Malaysian Airlines Flight 370. Now, since I do record the podcast before it goes live, information can, of course, change. So I'm not really going to share any new, updated, timely information, but some information that has been released throughout the week that I found absolutely fascinating because it really helps share the difficulties that authorities are having. So let's take a look at some of the information. So one of the first things that came out was this whole business about the passports, about the falsified passports. Are they part of a terrorist ring? Are they part of some other dubious group? And I have to say that Interpol did a great job. They were very forthright, coming out and saying that they did a lot of research, and they said right off the bat, this does not appear to be terrorism, which was great because in this very, very cyclical news day where you just have every hour you have to have a new report, some breaking news, if it bleeds, it leads. I was very pleased to see that Interpol and other authorities were very quick to say, once they had pretty much ruled out terrorism, that they made that known so that the news agencies and people wouldn't worry. Now, with regards to the false passports, they've also done some great checking on that, and it appears that 2 of the individuals with the false passports may have been seeking asylum, and they actually found the youth's mother, which was also great. Great piece of detective work. Now, the thing that I really found interesting this week, aside from the search and all the technology that's being revealed about how the search is taking place, has been the so-called phantom phone calls. Now, if you haven't seen the stories yet, what happened was some of the family members were so distraught, they decided to try and phone their family members that were on MH370, which is a normal reaction. It's what I would do if Joe was on that plane and there was no records and I couldn't figure out what happened. I would try calling on the off chance that maybe you survived, maybe you're on some island someplace and you have signal. I don't know. But they tried calling. And what happened was the phones were ringing. And unfortunately, that was elevating some hope because we've all had phone calls. We've all made phone calls. We've all heard the ring on the other side, knowing that the other person is there and not picking up. So it made them all think, why aren't they picking up? And it turns out it was really the phone company. According to technology reports, when you place a phone call, it's actually up to the telephone operator to decide what you hear. If all the phones are on the same network or on adjacent networks, then there's an instant ping. So they can decide whether or not to continue the ring, or they can cut the ring if the phone is powered off or it goes to voicemail, what have you. But in this case, since the networks are searching for the phone, the telephone company, the telecom, wants to keep you on the line. And that's why it was playing rings. And I was really astonished at that because I was under the impression, naive as I was, I thought that a ring meant it was going through. And that's simply not the case. With the technology related to the search itself, that has been fascinating to see how radar information is being now crowdsourced, much in the way that SETI has been crowdsourced for years. I'm loving that this has become a massive, massive search to figure out what happened. And I've really enjoyed actually listening to aviation experts because since I do have a history in aviation, my father was a metallurgical engineer and worked on several of the biggest American fighter warcraft in the air. I grew up around that environment. I was very interested in it from a very young age. And to hear the total possibilities. Now, personally, my theory is that there had to have been a catastrophic error for the pilots not to issue some kind of mayday. I also subscribe to the theory that they are probably looking in the wrong area, and I was very happy to see that the search area had been expanded, because there's just no reason why, if you look along the trajectory, you would not find debris if that is in fact where the plane went down. Now, I do believe the plane went down because so much time has passed, but it'll be interesting to see what comes up with this and continue to monitor how media reports it. In terms of a disaster of this nature, I have, as I said, been very pleased with the way it has been reported. Fairly neutral, fairly factual, and not too sensationalized. When the first story did break out, I was a little bit disappointed with the way that some news organizations were focusing so much on the families at the airports. But that has waned a little bit. But now we're focusing more on the search, the technology, and I find that absolutely fascinating. In February, Tokyo-based Bitcoin exchange MtGox said it lost $400 million worth of Bitcoins from its customers. This amounted to 750,000 of its customers' Bitcoins and 100,000 of its own Bitcoins. Now, management said that the amount was stolen after hackers exploited a transaction bug to divert the funds. But some of MtGox's users aren't so sure, and they allege that the exchange owners are actually pocketing the cash. The hackers have used platforms such as Reddit and others to suggest that Karpels, the CEO, has access to some of the Bitcoins that he'd reported stolen. In support of this claim, they've uploaded a series of files that included a spreadsheet of more than 1 million trades, and this file also included Karpel's home address and a screenshot purportedly confirming the hacker's data. Included in this information is one particular file that shows the exchange's balances in 18 different currencies, and it has a total of 951,000 Bitcoins. And hackers point to this as evidence that MtGox is misrepresenting the current situation. Now, this is a very powerful allegation, and if true, would represent a huge theft. But one has to wonder, is a theft by the owners likely? And even then, those who actually did steal the money, the Bitcoins, what are they going to do with it? This is a digital transaction. This is digital currency. And as we all know, everything digital leaves a trace. So even if you have the Bitcoins, how are you actually going to use them? And I think that's the lesson learned. This is a developing currency. It's not insured by anybody, and it could be even conceived that traditional banks might have been behind it since their money is insured. Ultimately, it will be important to see how these stolen Bitcoins resurface, or if they ever do, because like I said, as soon as someone uses a single Bitcoin from the MtGox repository, it's going to point to the theft. And then those who stole the money will be on the radar once more. Beijing and Washington should take Asia Pacific as the testing ground of their commitment to build a new type relationship rather than a competitive arena, China Foreign Minister Wang Yi recently said. Quote, "We're willing to work with the United States to jointly maintain peace and stability in the Asia Pacific, as long as we really respect each other's sovereignty and territorial integrity, respect each other's social system and development path, and respect each other's core interests and major concerns. We'll for sure have a solid foundation of bilateral relations which can resist wind and rain." End quote. Now, why exactly is China saying this? Well, it's because not everyone accepts China's position on the East China Sea. In fact, only China really supports their position. No one in the ASEAN region acknowledges China's unilateral redrawing of its boundaries. Japan doesn't, and the United States doesn't. And the United States is actually actively working with other nations to support their claims, which will ultimately lead to more tension in the region. China is simply trying to lessen the tensions with overtures of peace, despite being unwilling to change their position. Recently, Japan scrambled some military jets to counter 3 Chinese planes that threw near Japanese airspace, defense officials said. Now, in particular, it was one Y-8 information gathering plane and 2 H-6 bombers that flew over the East China Sea, traveling in international airspace between southern Japanese islands, and then they went into the Pacific Ocean before turning around and returning to China along the same route. Now, these planes never entered Japanese airspace, and this is significantly different than when China redrew its ADIZ and the United States, Korea, Japan all flew planes into the air zone, kind of thumbing their nose at China. Now, it should be noted that China has the right to fly these planes in their own airspace, in international airspace, without entering or crossing over into the Japanese defense zones. However, as a precautionary note, it is usual for nations, like Japan in this case, to launch their own aircraft as a reactionary and precautionary matter, just so they can keep aware of where the other jets are and to, I guess, forcefully discourage the planes from even considering entering Japanese airspace. Now, the United States typically does not take any position on the sovereignty of islands, specifically in this instance, Senkaku, as it's called by Japan, and Diaoyu, as it's called in China. But it does recognize that Japan administers these islands. And the United States has said that it does fall under the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty, which obligates the United States to come to Japan's defense should it be attacked. Now, Japan wants to prioritize discussions on China and to clarify the respective United States and Japanese role in the event of what's being called a gray zone incident, meaning that should China try to forcibly take the islands, the disputed islands, what exactly is the United States going to do? Are they just going to provide logistic support, or would they be willing to get involved? And I think that is a brilliant, brilliant idea, because tensions are continuing to escalate. We're seeing China and Japan inching closer and closer to what unfortunately is going to be a physical confrontation. May not be a monumental confrontation, but some confrontation over these little islands. And bringing the United States in to really clearly define how they would respond to a number of scenarios will help act as a deterrent and hopefully as a de-escalation factor in this dispute. But also, it gives military leaders on the American side strict guidelines of what they are to follow, what things need to happen before they can get involved. And the overall hope is that this would save American lives because it would keep them out of harm in a number of different situations. Overall, the true tragedy with this dispute is that neither party is willing to talk to the other. Hopefully, by bringing in the United States, this will allow cooler heads to prevail and let all nations not lose anyone over this area. South Korean Foreign Minister Yoon Byung-se urged Japan to take steps to resolve the sex slavery issue, warning that it will otherwise face further isolation from the international community. It's imperative for the Japanese government to implement earnest measures as soon as possible that are acceptable to the comfort women victims and the international community. Now, this is a bold statement that is often made here in South Korea in regards to Japan, in regards to the colonial period between 1910 and 1945, and to the conscripted workers during that period, as well as the sexual slavery victims. However, there are a couple of problems with this statement. Now, first, Japan really isn't in isolation and actually enjoys strong relationships with the West as well as several ASEAN nations. In fact, Japan continues to heavily develop in these developing nations and is well received there. It's really only between South Korea and China that friction remains. Now, the second part of this actually deals with the whole notion of compensation. Now, the calls for working with comfort women sidesteps, in my opinion, Seoul's responsibility. Now, while I do think Tokyo and Japan need to do more, but the sticking issue really is the 1965 bilateral agreement between these two countries. Now, the Korean courts came out a few years ago and said that the government didn't have the authority to negotiate compensation on behalf of victims and was told to work directly with Tokyo, to work with Japan, to arrange new compensation. And that's because in the 1965 bilateral agreement, there's a clause in there, two clauses really. One says that this agreement is our official apology and we're paying reparations for all time. That's what Tokyo always comes back to saying. The second part of the agreement says that if there is a disagreement, that if one side wants to revisit the issue, it needs to go back to arbitration. And that's not what's happening. Now, some could argue that Korea is doing its due diligence by saying that Japan needs to work with the victims to arrange compensation, but that's a country dealing with individuals rather than two nations working together. It also kind of sidesteps the fact that when Japan paid the money to Korea in 1965, the Korean government took that money, about half of it, in some cases 3/4 of it, and put it back into the nation, helped develop roads, helped develop POSCO. It really didn't come out until a few years ago that Japan had actually paid a lot of money, in some estimates $800 million in reparations for the colonial period, for victims that Korea used in other ways. And what I always find interesting in this particular discussion, both here in Korea and abroad, is that why does no one talk to the Korean government? Why do all the discussions automatically face Japan? Why do they always ask Japan for more money rather than why not ask the Korean government, where did the money go that was supposed to go to me? Because Japan paid the Korean government and they were supposed to distribute that money to all the victims. And that just really didn't happen. Now, that case could be made that two nations made the agreement, Japan paid Korea, and Korea felt that as a custodian of the funds, they needed to put them in the best use, and that would be developing the nation. And I could see that be a very plausible argument as we look at how quickly Korea has developed post-Korean War. In the 70 years, it's amazing to see what this nation has achieved. But from an educational standpoint, those that are seeking compensation are looking only towards Japan. And I really wonder, would they really be doing that if they had a better channel of communication with the South Korean government? Or is it the case just because they were the oppressors, they become an easier target? Ultimately, I think the only way this issue will ever be resolved is if Tokyo sits down with an arbitrator to go over the fine lines of the 1965 bilateral agreement to see if Japan is right to say, no, we've paid in full, or to see if there is cause for revisiting the disbursement of funds for reparations. That's the only way all sides will be satisfied. A job at Samsung is often highly sought after here in Korea, but it may not be all it's cracked up to be. Living close to one of the major plants here in Korea, I see firsthand the long hours and know people who have lost loved ones from literally being worked to death. Now, a new documentary called Another Family tells of the challenges the workers face. And I want to share a few stories, a few quotes that came out in a recent story. These are from Park Min-suk, who actually worked for Samsung. When I was in the final year studying IT at Byeolgyo Commercial High School in the South Jeolla province, the school started looking for students to apply for jobs on the line making semiconductors for Samsung. While I was a little nervous about the idea of working on the line, I raised my hand, excited about the advantages Samsung could offer. I had been impatient to leave the countryside and make money and give something back to my parents, and I jumped at what looked like the perfect opportunity. My first day on the job was June 4th, 1991, a date I will never forget. For us, the date we started working at Samsung was second in importance only to our birthday. Each time the day rolled around, we would encourage and congratulate each other and buy each other presents just as if it was our birthday. There were 3 8-hour shifts, 6 to 2, 2 to 10, and 10 to 6. The semiconductor factory operated 24 hours a day. For the first 3 years, I had 1 day off a month. Work was so difficult that all I did on my day off was sleep. Now, during her time at the plant, Pak suffered from infertility and later developed breast cancer. And many feel that the conditions of the plant directly contributed to that. So just be careful what you wish for. It may not be all it's cracked up to be. And if you're interested, please check out this documentary. Again, it's called Another Family and chronicles several people who worked for Samsung. This past week marked the 3rd anniversary of the Great East Japan earthquake that rocked the nation at 2:46 p.m. on March 11th. Since that time, TEPCO and the Japanese government have been trying to calm the nerve of residents and try to fix one of the worst disasters in history. While I think both entities have not done their best to get the situation under control, and by that I mean calling in outside experts to help and coordinate with local officials, I was actually curious to know what some in Japan thought. So I asked. And I actually got a number of comments. They range from not very well to completely disgusted. And one of the best comments, I think, summed it up perfectly. To be honest, I think they have their hands full and are probably trying to do their best. That doesn't necessarily mean they are doing their best. I'd sure like to see them drop some pride and call them some outside help. And I think it's clear that even now, TEPCO and the Japanese government are fighting to repair 2 disasters. One, of course, is the reactor, and the other is their reputations, neither of which are progressing at the desired pace. Now, finally, a little bit of good news out of Japan, and this story actually dates back to March 4th, where a 55-year-old gentleman by the name of Kenji Shiro, who happens to be the president of a security firm, withdrew a lot of money from a Japanese ATM. They estimated, several tens of thousands of yen, and each 10,000 yen is about $100. Now, what happened was that he left the money in the machine. He got it, and then something happened, and he left the ATM, but left his money there. And he went to his ultimate destination. 10 minutes later, he realized that, oh my gosh, I don't have my money. And he actually went back to the ATM. And you know what? The cash was still there. Now, if I had done this, I would have been preparing for the worst. And I actually don't know if I would have gone there. Actually, I do know. If I took out a couple of $100 from an ATM, a couple of 100,000 won, I would most certainly go back to the ATM. But as myself, Mr. Shiro was preparing for the worst, and he was actually extremely moved and was so happy when he got to the ATM to find his money that he snapped a picture and uploaded it to his Facebook account. And since that time, the picture of his celebration has gone almost a little bit viral with hundreds of likes, lots of comments, and it really snowballed, showing how good a community can be. Now, this is what Mr. Shiro had to say. Maybe no one took the money because there was a surveillance camera nearby. Actually, several years ago, I dropped my wallet while I was getting out of a taxi late at night in front of my house. Early the next morning, I got a phone call from the local police station that someone had found it while taking a walk. I was overcome by such emotion at the time as well. I really need to be more careful from now on as the president of a security firm. I can't be setting a bad example for others. I will reflect hard on my actions from now on. Now, many of us live in countries where this just would not happen. Thankfully, in Korea, it's generally safe, and we're able to recover a lot of lost things. I certainly have forgotten the phone or a computer or some other piece of technology at a bar and gone back several hours later only to find that the bar staff took it and put it behind the counter. I'm very thankful for that. If I was in another Southeast Asian country, and especially the United States, those things would be long gone. But it's nice to see that there are still good people out there. So I want to hear from you. What is your Good Samaritan story? Have you ever lost something, thought it was permanently lost, but only to find that it was ultimately returned to you? Please share your thoughts with me in the comment section or tweet me at ChiRanger. That will do it for this week's episode of Asia News Weekly. Thank you so much for joining me. Now, for all the information about the stories I mentioned this week, please check the show notes out over at chiranger.com. If you have any comments, I really do welcome them, so please leave them on the podcast page, or you can tweet me, or you can shoot me a personalized message with your thoughts or your feedback. Just send a message to podcast@chiranger.com. Now, if you're an iTunes user, I hope you'll also consider leaving some feedback there. It's a way for the podcast to get featured, to grow, and also a way for me to hear directly from you about what you think about the podcast. Now, every day I share pictures and videos from my life and travels, not only here in Korea, but around the world. So if you're really interested to see what life in Asia is like, please follow me on Twitter. You can find me at ChiRanger, that's QI Ranger. Well, that's it for this episode. So until next time, stay true to yourself and always be awesome. Asia News Weekly is written and produced by Steve Miller and licensed under a Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial No Derivatives 4.0 International License.